Okay, I think we can start with some introductory remarks as a few more people are joining our presentation this afternoon. So once again, good afternoon to everybody on the call. This is Kat from the Delegation of German Industry and Commerce in Nigeria, AHK Nigeria. We're hosting today's session on HR imperatives and response to COVID-19. And we first want to express our appreciation for everybody on the call for joining us today. A bit of housekeeping before I dive into our exciting agenda today. First of all, I apologize, my video is not working, but the good news is our speakers have the video up and running, so you'll see who's talking to you later on, even if I remain in the dark. Apologies for that. More housekeeping, especially for people who are new to this platform, GoToWebinar. You should be able to see the attendees. If you go to the control panel, for most people it's on the right-hand side, and you can see who else is on the call. It is important to note that we had almost 70 people sign up for today's session. That means that there may be business partners, clients, suppliers of yours on the call. Please take that into account when later on you share your experiences or questions. We have screened everybody who has signed up, though we cannot vouch for the actual identity of people who signed up. So please bear that in mind when sharing any information, and please refrain from sharing any confidential information in this call, directly in this call. A bit more housekeeping, all of you are on mute right now because it's such a big group and because we need to keep the flow of the event running. We will have two input presentations that I will explain to you in a minute. We will collect questions in the chat function that is also in your control panel. There is a tab called chat, in which you can raise questions, comments, etc., that we will then, as moderators, take up to ask after each session. We will also open the discussion to voice contributions from participants later on, in which we will ask you to raise your hands. But please use the chat function, especially during the input presentations, as questions arise, so we can make sure that your question can be asked, even though we're quite a few people on this call. In terms of agenda, what you've all joined us for, AHK Nigeria, we have been working with a lot of our partner companies, especially during these difficult times of COVID-19 and all the effects that it brings with it in terms of health implications, restrictions of movements, lockdown, and of course the impact on economic activity and economic growth projections. And we've heard from many of our partner companies that they already have to take or consider HR measures to adapt to the new reality. So we thought it would be good for AHK Nigeria to provide a platform where we can share some professional insights, the input presentations, and also give a platform to raise questions and share experiences among the companies. Again, please take into consideration that the group today is fairly large, so this cannot replace a one-on-one consultation or a case assessment for individual cases from your companies or your teams. The Delegation of German Industry and Commerce in Nigeria, we are also forced to look at reassessing our portfolio in times of COVID-19. Because what you usually know us for, live events, trade fairs, delegation trips, all of that is now, of course, falling flat for the foreseeable future. And considering the economic impact of COVID-19 on Nigeria, but also Germany, our main partner market, we need to see how things develop in the months to come. What we can assure you of is that we're here to support you. We're here to support you during COVID-19 and beyond, because the changes around us also force us to reassess what is to come. So now is the right time to build a portfolio and a business approach for the time after COVID-19. So feel free to talk to us as well if you're planning ahead and you need support in terms of market entry, business development, or business partner search, or specific market information in growth markets like agribusiness, infrastructure, that will remain growth markets no matter the outcome of the COVID-19 scenario. Now, getting back to our topic today, HR measures. I am excited to announce 2 speakers today that will provide us some professional input that can inform our experience exchange after. The first speaker that we will have is Mrs. Perenami Momodu, who's a partner at Alex, where she is part of several practice groups, including dispute resolution, insolvency, energy, agriculture, and labor practice. So she will give us information about the legal framework for COVID-19 induced HR measures. This will be the first presentation I'll hand over in a minute. After that presentation, we'll have a quick questions and answer sessions. Again, a reminder, please raise your questions in the chat function. So we will pick those questions first after her presentation. And then as a second presentation, we look more at the operational perspective of implementing HR responses to COVID-19. And here I'm very happy to welcome Mrs. Ivy Temitayo Ibitoye, Head of HR at Udo Odoma and Bello Osagie, who is a human resource management professional with cutting across performance management, employee engagement, change management, HR policies and procedures. So another right person to inform us today. So again, we're having 2 presentations. First, looking at the legal framework for COVID-19 induced HR measures, followed by a Q&A session. Then we'll move into the operational perspective, and again, followed by a Q&A session and some room and time to discuss some experiences from the companies and participants on this call. So to start with, I would ask Mrs. Momodu to take over and shed some light on the legal framework for COVID-19 induced HR measures.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kat. Thank you to the entire AHK Nigeria team for putting this together. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Perenami Momodu. I'm a partner at Alex, and one of my areas of expertise is labor and employment. There's no need introducing the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know what is happening. Most of us are already working from home or, on lockdown, as we say. So I'm going to share my screen in a minute or in less than, so we can see what my presentation is about and while I go through it. So, okay, so I'm sure we can all see my screen now. So I'm just going to go through it very briefly. So on the labor and employment front, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, has predicted that there will be up to 25 million loss of jobs as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of economies, a lot of governments are already trying to put in things in place or put in measures in place to mitigate the effects of the losses that would occur with respect to employment. Now, in Nigeria, we have the economic stimulus bill. Now, while the economic stimulus bill does not directly provide for labor and employment measures or what employers and employees should do, it does provide tax rebates for employees who retain their workforce by December 2020. So, but I mean, that's just an incentive. Other than that, there's really nothing saying, employees don't sack, employees sack. And even the tax, like I said, is an incentive. So you could enjoy that incentive if you choose to maintain your workforce. Nothing is mandating you to do that. So again, some of the issues that companies have been faced with in this whole pandemic is, do they retain their workforce? Do they renegotiate employment terms? Can they declare a force majeure on contracts of employment? Can they ask employees to work from home? So all those issues are things that I would consider as we go along in this presentation. Now, if we look at the legal framework generally, now, I've already mentioned that there's really nothing has really changed in Nigeria, apart from the economic stimulus bill, which hasn't been passed into law yet, which merely just gives incentives for employers if they retain their workers. Now, what that means is that the labor laws, as we know it, are still the same. There's no new regulation to cushion the effect of the labor and employment law crisis that we will face as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the primary legislation for labor law in Nigeria is the Labor Act. Now, before we proceed, it's important for me to make a quick distinction on who the Nigerian Labor Act applies to. Now, if you've had a look at the Labor Act, or if you had any encounter with it, you would see that there's a lot of reference to the term workers. Now, 80% of the Labor Act applies to employees who can be classified as workers. Now, workers are defined as persons exercising manual labor or clerical work. Now, so for other classes of employees, those not exercising manual labor or clerical functions within an organization, they will then be exercising executive, professional, administrative, or technical functions. Those groups, categories that I've just mentioned are not workers. So therefore, certain provisions of the Labor Act will not be applicable to them. So what happens in practice is, if you have in your employment persons who are executives or professionals or exercising administrative or technical functions, the recourse would be to their contract of employment. So basically, what would govern would not be the law; it will be their contracts of employment. Now, if we go on to some of the COVID-19 HR-induced measures which companies have been talking about, companies have been, personally, I've received a lot of questions from clients on this issue. So these are the things that I want to talk about here. And some of them are as to whether companies can go ahead with a declaration of redundancy, whether and to what extent they can do that, whether they can go ahead to terminate employment in large numbers, if there can be some sort of following work. Can there be like an extended leave or leave without pay? Can there be a leave with pay? Can we convert the lockdown period to an annual leave? Remote working, what happened? What regulations govern remote working? Can we reduce salaries? Can we ask employees to work maybe say 2 times a week? And in essence, can we renegotiate the terms of the contract of employment? So these are some of the things that a lot of companies are trying to deal with, or trying to find out how to go over. Now, my session is dealing with the legal framework. So which is what I'll take us now on to what extent you can, for instance, declare redundancy. To what extent are you allowed to do so, and to what extent are you not? Now, the first one, let's go on with the redundancy. Now, earlier I had mentioned that the Labor Act is particular about classes of workers that it applies to. Now, with respect to redundancy, the provisions of the Labor Act only applies to workers. And the workers I've said are those exercising manual labor or clerical work functions within an organization, right? So for those that are not, these provisions they could serve as a guide, but you don't have to comply with these provisions. Now, for workers, the Labor Act has listed out a procedure. The first is that you are mandated to inform, if there's a trade union, you're mandated to inform the trade union. If there's not, you call a representative of the workers and inform them of the reasons for and the extent of the redundancy. Now, of course, the reasons in this time would be, look, there's the pandemic, you're not able to provide work, so there's now an excess of manpower, as a result of the pandemic. So you then have to declare a redundancy. And then once you inform, you then have to follow the principle of last in, first out. Now, what that means is that the last person to be employed is the first person to be leaving in the event of a redundancy. Of course, you then have to look at, subject to other factors such as merit, skill. So if you combine all these factors and I mean, these factors will then determine if the last in should then be going first out. The last thing that the Labour Act requires to be done in the declaration of redundancy with respect to workers is that the employer is expected to use its best endeavors to negotiate redundancy payments. Now, in practice, this is where there's usually, some issues with redundancy, especially where unions are involved. Now, an employer's best endeavors may not be deemed so by the workers' representatives or by the trade unions. So sometimes you find that, employers and employees are disputing what the best endeavors are, or the redundancy benefits that are being negotiated. So, but with respect to non-workers, all this don't apply. In practice, employers would also use the best endeavors to negotiate redundancy payments, even though they are not mandated by law to do so, with respect to those who are classified as non-workers. Now, like I said, the COVID-19 pandemic, if it applies that there is really an excess of manpower in an organization, it seems like a good enough reason to be declaring a redundancy and asking those who have no work, especially those who are not able to work remotely, asking them, or declaring them redundant. Now, another one which employers have been asking for is on termination. Now, in my experience, I've seen that in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, or as we are experiencing it here in Nigeria, there are two classes of employers. There are those who say, look, we can't go on any further, we have to let our people go. And there are those who say, you know what, we want to wait it out. We don't know how long this would be, but for now, we don't want to terminate, we don't want to declare redundancy. But for the first class, the options are really redundancy and termination, who cannot afford to keep their employees any longer. Now, of that class, like I said, redundancy may be a good option. Pandemic is a good enough reason. Termination, on the other hand, if you decide that when the pandemic is over, you don't want to go through the stress, or you would not have to go through the stress of recruiting new set of hands, then maybe you can proceed with the termination. Now, under Nigerian law, an employer is permitted to hire and fire at will without giving reason, but I'll go into that in a few seconds. Now, there are exceptions to this rule to hiring and firing at will, and those exceptions are where the contracts have statutory flavor. So if you're working with a government ministry or women on maternity leave, employers are not allowed to fire women while they're on maternity leave. Now, I said you really don't have to provide reasons. So basically, you can issue a notice of termination and say, please note that your employment will hereby be terminated on 31st April, or whatever notice period that you're allowed to give, without stating why. Now, that has been, for years, that's what we've done. That's been the best practice. But more recently, the National Industrial Court, which is the court of first instance, has then decided that it will accord international best standards or best practices if an employer gives reason. Now, if an employer decides to, now note that this is a decision of the National Industrial Court, like I said, the court of first instance. The appellate courts have not held so. So in my view, you can still proceed to terminate without giving reason. Now, but if you do decide to give a reason for termination, again, the COVID-19 pandemic is a good enough reason to be terminating employment contracts. Now, when it comes to the notice period, for workers, again, the workers, non-workers distinction will keep appearing in this document because that's the state of our law in Nigeria. Now, for workers, manual laborers or clerical workers, the Labour Act provides minimum notice periods to be given. But typically, in practice, or typically, in my experience, you see that most contracts have a 1 month termination period. Now, if you must give notice of termination, or you can choose to pay in lieu of notice. Now, for non-workers as well, the terms of their contracts will determine how to fire. So basically, give notice or payment in lieu of such notice. Now, another option is following. Following under Nigeria is not really a legally recognized term, at least as far as the Labor Act is concerned. But we have suspension of work in our act, or leave without pay, which is what I'm dealing with now. Now, for workers under the Labor Act, an employer has a duty to provide work suitable to the employee's capacity on every day that he shows himself fit for work. So what that means is that on the surface, if I go to work today, my employer has a duty and I'm fit for work, even though sometimes there's disputes as to whether the employee is fit or not, but that's a separate issue. Now, if I present myself at work and I am fit for work, my employer has a duty, a statutory duty, to provide work for me to do. Now, if it does not provide work for me to do, maybe there's a pandemic or whatever it is, he then has a duty to pay me as if he had provided work for me to do. So I think, for those who, for employers who fall into the category of not wanting to let go of their employers completely, they have to be very careful and take note of this statutory provision. Like I said, employer has a duty to provide work, and if he's not able to provide that work, then he has a duty to pay the employee as if he had provided the work. Now, the exception to this, thankfully the Labor Act gives an exception, which is that where there's a temporary emergency or circumstances beyond an employer's control, the employer may not be able to provide work. Now, so what that means basically is that the Labor Act understands that, look, something might have happened and that an employer cannot provide work. So the recourse for the employer there is that, or the proviso for the employer there is that situation that is not allowing him to provide work should not extend 1 week. That's what the Labor Act says. So if, for instance, if we're going to use the pandemic, typically an employer would not be allowed to not provide work for a period over a week. Now, to mitigate the effect of that on the employer, the Labor Act then goes ahead to say, if that situation does arise, then the employer would only pay wages for 1 day. So let's say an employer is not able to provide work for a whole week. He's allowed to do that under the Labor Act. But then again, he would only pay wages for 1 day. So employees come to work Monday to Friday, but they only get salaries for 1 day. Now, because this period, because the Labor Act only says 1 week, the Labor Act also says that you can extend this provision beyond a week, but then you need the consent of an authorized labor officer, who is an officer of the Nigerian Federal Ministry of Labor and Productivity. Now, in practice, especially where you have situations like this, we find that it may not be practical to quickly, obtain that consent. If you look at the situation now, there's a lockdown in Lagos, there's a lockdown in the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja, where the Federal Ministry of Labor and Productivity is located. So if an employer were to not be able to provide work for a week and wanted to extend it beyond that period, that employer would be having some difficulty with trying to reach the ministry to seek that extension of time beyond a week. So in practice, what we would advise, or what is recommended, is that an employer in such a situation negotiates with the workers to say, look, I'm not able to provide work for you for, say, a month or 2 months. I can pay you, and by law, I'm only permitted to pay you salary for a day. I can decide to say, I'll pay you salary for 2 weeks, for 1 week. So the idea of that is, if an employer is able to negotiate first with the employees, the employer can then, the employer can use that act of negotiation as a show of good faith by subsequently writing to the Ministry of Labor and Productivity, informing the ministry that, look, I have taken advantage of the provisions of the Labor Act, which ask me to, if I'm not able to provide work, to only pay salary for 1 day. I have taken advantage of that provision, but I have extended my period to a period of 2 months because there's a pandemic, and I have also, in good faith, negotiated a 2-week salary payment with my workers, and they have accepted. I think if an employer were to take that step, it would show, like I said, an act of good faith. And because these are unprecedented times, I don't see how the Federal Ministry of Labor and Productivity will berate such an employer for extending that period over a week. Now, like I said, this provision of not providing work for a week and payment of wages or salary for 1 day only applies to workers. Now, with non-workers who are persons in professional, administrative, technical, or functional, or technical or professional function, you can negotiate anything with those classes of people because they are not bound by the provisions of the Act, or the terms of their contract of employment is not governed by the provisions of the Act. Now, hello, I hope everybody can hear me. Now, you can negotiate this sort of agreement or this sort of thing in their contract of employment by basically by agreeing with them beforehand. So if you do that, for those classes, you can say to them for three months, I'm not going to be able to pay you, or I'm not going to have work for you for 3 weeks, but I can only pay for a month, or I can pay for 2 weeks, or whatever it is. If they agree to it, then that's fine, but that's fine by all parties. Now, with respect to leave without pay, a lot of employers have also reached out to ask, oh, what's the procedure? How do we do it? Now, it's important to note again, so that there's no breach of statutory requirements, that the Labour Act provides that employers, an employee is allowed to go on leave for at least 6 weeks, or a worker is allowed to go on leave for at least 6 days, but he must be paid for that leave. That's a statutory provision. So you can't really contract out of that. So so those are things that you have to note. Paying or going on leave without pay will be deemed a breach of the Labour Act, at least for workers. Now, for non-workers, like I said, the terms of their contract of employment will guide, such discussions, and to the extent to which, the employers wish to do so. Now, for remote working, most of us now are working remotely, and there's a lot of uncertainty with regards to remote working. Now, of course, there are no regulations in Nigeria governing or guiding remote work, but what is important, or what is important to note, is that employers really should be using best practices to regulate this remote working procedure. And, employers really should, based on best labor practices, should be providing tools for employees to be able to work from home. Because, you could, there could be the risk of liability for the employer if the liability, for instance, says, look, this employer is not working, and the employee says, but I wasn't provided tools to work with from home because, hey, remote working wasn't part of the contract in the first place. Again, it's important to note another issue is what happens with injury at workplace, where workplace is now whole. Now, the Employee Compensation Act is the one which governs compensation for death or injury suffered by an employee in the course of his employment. And that act also defines a workplace as any place a person performs work or is required to be in the course of his employment. Now, these are things that are being considered everywhere. It will be interesting to see how the courts would rule on this provision. But so far, if in the course of your employment you have to work from home, then that's your workplace. Now, what would then be determined is are the actions which led to the injury, if they can reasonably be in contemplation of an employer to then say that those were injuries that happened while at work. Now, again, like I said, a lot of employers are seeking to renegotiate contract of employment. Now, if you're trying to maybe reduce salaries, create flexible work structures, even say go on leave without pay, these are usually contractually agreed terms. So anything otherwise would be renegotiating these terms. So if, for instance, you say, look, I'm going to reduce your salaries, or you were coming to work from Monday to Friday, you're not only required to come, or you're not only required to work remotely Mondays and Tuesdays, you've essentially reduced the work times, and the pay may reduce. Now, in such instances, you then have to renegotiate, because by law, an employer cannot unilaterally amend the terms of a contract of employment. It has to be, by agreement of both parties. Now, there's also a risk that the employer should be aware of, that when the courts resume and if employees wish to challenge some of these HR-induced measures, especially with respect to renegotiations, there's the risk that the court may view some of those renegotiated terms as unfair clauses or unfair legal practices and unenforceable. For instance, if an employer says, you know what, you're going to go on leave from now till December, from March till December, and I'm not going to pay you. That, to me, would be an unfair clause, because clearly someone is going to be on leave, without being paid for about 9 months. So if an employer is faced with those kind of issues, the best course will then be at that time maybe to terminate employment so that risks are reduced for the employer, or to declare redundancy. That might be a tidier way to do it, to avoid liability. Now, it's also important to note that with respect to renegotiation of contract terms, now, as a ground for renegotiation, an employer may say, look, there's a force majeure, which is a circumstance beyond my reasonable contemplation or your reasonable contemplation. Now, the employer could rely on a force majeure clause. Now, typically, we see that a lot of contracts of employment, especially with the low-cadre employees, don't have force majeure clauses. But if there is a force majeure clause, and the clause is wide enough to be to permit pandemics or epidemics as we have now, then it is possible that an employer may be able to rely on that clause to suspend its obligations. So, for instance, if there's a force majeure clause in the manager's contract, right? And which includes pandemics, or which contemplates pandemics, then, or epidemics. The employer may say, for instance, look, I'm not able to pay salaries from now till next year. I'm not able to provide work. So therefore, my obligations with respect to payment of salary and provision are hereby ended. The employer can rely on the force majeure provision to suspend those obligations without necessarily terminating the contract of employment. So what that is that the contract continues, the contract, those obligations are suspended for the period where that force majeure was declared until force majeure has been lifted. That's force majeure. Now, frustration on the if there's a force majeure clause, or if the force majeure clause, or if pandemic cannot be interpreted to be contemplated within the force majeure clause, then we then be seeking to discharge the contract of employment on ground of frustration. Now, what frustration means is that the contract can no longer be formed, as opposed to first your obligations, or labor and employment obligations are suspended as an employer. For frustration, they are totally discharged. So, and as a with respect to the contract terms, do you want to rely on the major clause? If you don't, are you willing to hold the employees and have contracted frustrated? I mean, if you're trying to, for instance, negotiate redundancy payments, employees are saying, look, want a certain amount, and you are saying, oh, you want a certain amount. It is possible that, decisions may break down at that stage, at which point you can then declare. Now, again, I've just been informed that great. I hope everyone can hear me. I don't know what was missed out. I've tried to my internet connection now. Oops. One of the I'm rounding out, and one of the fallouts the COVID-19 is will be a rise induced in dismissment allegation of non-performance of contract obligation. I mean, you would employee trying to employers for what you failing to pay salaries, failing to pay allowance, if both things were usually both contractually failing to pay and all that. Of course, there's so defenses employer in that circumstance rely on. So that one of the issues may arise. Of course, also breach of status to seek the consent of the authorized officer to not doesn't do that, then it may, see for the employer in such instances. Of course, again, renegotiations of contract terms. If salaries are being due from around the lower rounds, there will certainly be disputes with renegotiation of those contracts. It is envisaged that employees may begin to challenge HR-induced COVID HR-induced measures as being unfavorable. So what that gives is a general overview of where we are now in respect to labor employment laws. Of course, several individual unique factors unique to different organizations. So it will be best to seek legal counsel with respect to all unique set of facts. You can see the risk of this expertise such that over.
Nami, can you still hear us?
Hello.
Sorry, your connection has gone really bad. I think people have relied on reading the slides for the past few minutes. Nami? Okay. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We are trying to get Nami back because there have been a few questions.
I can hear you now. I'm sorry, I just heard that.
Speak up again.
Oh, I see. Do you know how long that went for? Want me to take it again?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Would you like me to take that in?
Yeah, people are asking whether they could have the slides after the presentation to catch up on the things that they may have missed. We can't hear you right now. Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, sorry, we don't seem to hear you. Your connection is really bad. Would you mind? I don't know, you turned your video off already, which I think helped, but your speech was really distorted. So people are asking whether they could have the slides after the meeting to catch up on things that they may have missed.
I don't know. Yes, sure, certainly. I will definitely share the slide.
Okay. Nami, I would say because your connection is bad, we would pull in the second presentation and hold the questions for you when you're back on track, because there are quite a number of questions for you, which I think is important. Maybe you can try to log off, come back in while we jump dynamically into our second presentation. Apologies to everybody. This, of course, is real life webinar happening. This is our new reality with COVID-19. So I would suggest we move into the second presentation, as I don't want to move the questions now because Perenami may not be able to answer appropriately because of the technical issues. Ivy, would you be ready to speak now?
I actually finished now. I finished because I saw the message on my computer. All right, thanks, sir. Okay. All right. Let me try and go down. Yes.
Sorry, I guess I'm not the only one who has trouble right now. Ivy, are you on the call?
Yes, I'm here.
Would you mind stepping in with your contribution now, and then we hope Nami to come back online with a better connection to address the questions that have already been raised?
Okay, sure, not a problem. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Hi, Yolanda and Kathleen. Thank you. Our conversations really will be around the operational aspect and what we are doing as human resources professionals to provide adequate support to our people. I think that for us, we've always had it at the back of our minds that this is the first time that we are having to deal with something like this. So we've never had to deal with a pandemic, at least at my young age, no. So this is new for as many of us as possible. And we've tried as much as possible to have it at the back of our minds that our people are extremely important to us. Which is why I think for me, the start was always empathy, being empathetic to the individuals, being empathetic to the people who work with us, understanding that this is as much confusion for them as individuals as much as it is for us corporate organizations. So what we've done is to try as much as possible to ensure that the operational aspect of our business continues to run. Even if it may not be as effective or efficient 100% as it used to be before, but we've tried to modify the process as opposed to eliminating the processes completely. So if you look at all the pillars of human resource management, for instance, when it comes to recruitment, talent acquisition, we have ensured that we're able to continue to do this effectively while working from home. We've ensured that we've kept our managers, our supervisors who will typically help us to interview, help us to shortlist candidates to still be able to do this so that their routine doesn't change as much simply because they're not working from the office. Same thing for training and development. Thankfully, there are many online courses now that are available to people at no cost. But as a firm, what we are doing at the moment is ensuring that we are procuring as many webinars, as many online courses for our people to keep them active and so that they're actually learning even if they are home and not doing active work. Now, one of the things that really has bothered a lot of people, and I've gotten a lot of questions from my own colleagues at work, is what does this mean for us? Are you going to cut our salaries? Are we going to still have leave days for the year? The truth is that every time I engage with human resources professionals, I find that there is no clear-cut rule as to how to deal with this. A lot of things come into play: financial of the company, the culture of the company, what is most comfortable for management at the time, and the people of the company. So I cannot exactly say that this is the specific way that these matters should be handled. But what I do encourage and I do implore people to consider is empathy. Remember that a lot of your employees did not plan to stay at home. They're not even happy to be on lockdown. They want to come to work. So that conversation of, you know what, since this is vacation for you, when you come back to work, you have to give up your leave days may not be as easy as we think it will be, because people have planned their vacations. People are planning to go and see their children who are outside the country during the summer, you know, and what if things actually just fix themselves and people are able to travel? Would you then say that would you then say that because the members of staff were at home during this lockdown period, they are not entitled to take their leave periods to spend time with family? So I know that it's a bit of a fix for organizations, but we always implore empathy. Same thing with remuneration. I find that a lot of organizations are having conversations with their people, and thankfully, employees are being empathetic to the situation as well. A lot of them are already expecting that because they're not working, they may not get their full remuneration. And for those who are working, organizations are saying, you know what, you need to clock in your hours. We need to know how many hours you work and you clock in per day so that we know if we can pay you in full or not in full and the like. So operationally, we have tried as much as possible to keep things to be the way they used to be as much as possible, just to also help the mental state and psychological state of members of staff. As regards employee engagement, employee welfare, we've also ensured that we keep in touch with our people. So we created lots of groups. So there are team groups, there are WhatsApp groups, there are, small groups of people who, we just check in once in a while. How's everyone doing? Just so that people do not feel disconnected. And as head of HR, I find that I'm in almost all the groups because I need to also make sure that my people are doing very well. We've also tried to ensure that people are engaged. So we've come up with different things. So there are quizzes, there are tasks, there are team building activities that we do though virtually, just so that we can keep our people together, collaboration within teams as effective and efficient as possible. So we also ensured, I remember Penami when she was speaking, spoke about the fact that organizations have to provide tools. We had to make that decision that if we're going to encourage our people to work from home, the onus and the burden was on us to make sure that we provided every single tool that is required to make that happen. We're very, very aware of where we live in. Power is an issue, so beyond the fact that we said, okay, we'll buy laptops for people who do not have personal laptops. How about I now have a personal laptop, but there's no light for me to power? How do we make sure that people have fuel in their generators? How do we help people with the wear and tear on their generators? Because they'll probably be turned on for longer periods than before. We thought about data. So people are frustrated. I'm using my hotspot, but I spend up to 30,000 naira a month simply because I'm trying to do research and the like. So the organization has had to, subsidize and just support our people much more during this period because we recognize the constraint. And that's really what we are appealing to organizations to do. At the end of the day, every company can become as successful, as wonderful as they would love to be, but they can only do this if they have the right team. Now, it is your responsibility to make sure that your team is the right team by doing everything possible to encourage them, provide for them, and support them during this period. Okay, so I know I was given 10 minutes, and I thought that I would keep to my 10 minutes as well. Just looking at my notes, a few things we also thought to do was make sure that people are abreast of what is going on. So I find that a lot of organizations are not talking to their people. People do not know if they are going to be terminated. People do not know if they're ever going to come back to work. And there's a lot of fear and uncertainty and doubts that's just in the atmosphere. So even as a company, what we did was we created a group for this remote period that has everybody in the group where we talk about these things. We hold like staff meetings on the group where we talk about these things. People are able to ask their questions, get clarification. And for the areas we are not 100% certain on how things are going to run, we are honest and open enough to say, we don't know. We don't know if we're going to ask that you forfeit your leave days. We don't know if we're going to say, no, it's not a problem, take your leave days. There are so many areas that are not clear, but open communication helps. So even if we do come and say, you know what, we can't keep up with remuneration, people understand because we've carried them along subsequently. So that's what we've been doing operations-wise, and I think every day we just modify and come up with new ways to assist our people as much as possible. We've had a couple of people who reach out to us saying, I think I'm having symptoms of COVID. What do I do? We've been able to put a process in place to be able to attend to such people to escalate. We're working actively with our healthcare providers as well, so that when we have issues like that, they can get permits quickly to make it to the hospital and the like. So I think as an organization, we're doing everything we can to be present for our employees. For us, that is paramount.
Great, thank you very much, Evie, for your input. I'm very sure this will create some further discussion among the participants. However, before we open up the floor, we welcome Perenami back to our talk. And I would suggest that we go through the questions that have been raised before we open up the discussion. Though Evie, you're not yet off the hook, because there's one question linked to the way you started. You said that you were sharing webinars and online courses with staff. There's a question whether you can share links or websites to webinars, online courses, ideally free ones. Of course, we as AHK also take the question up.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure that I can do that. Is it to send it to Yolanda? Yolanda can then share it to people who participated. I'm sure we can do that.
That would be great. Thank you very much. And then we have a series of questions regarding or related to Perenami's introduction. So I would suggest we go through those first. Perenami, can you hear us? Wait.
Yes.
Can you hear us? Yes,
I can
great.
hear you clearly.
Sorry, I have unmuted you. That was my mistake. So I'm taking the questions backwards. The last question raised to your presentation was, could you please explain the difference in terms of providing benefits between redundancy and termination?
So for termination, what's the kind of benefits that you provide are accrued benefits? That's for termination. So if you're owing the employee some leave allowance or 13th month or whatever is accrued as at the date of termination, that's what you provide. Now for redundancy, it's different. So for redundancy, for instance, you will be negotiating different sorts of benefits as opposed to those that have been accrued alone. So it's not a one size fits all. Some employers, for instance, would say, look, in addition to your accrued benefits, we could also give you some sort of a package, severance package or whatever it is. That's what really redundancy benefits are. So they could be extra. But for termination benefits, they're not usually extra. They're just what is contractually agreed or what has accrued to you at the date of termination.
Great, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Another question to clarify from the first speaker, that is you, Perenami. I quote, am I right to say from your presentation that professionals such as lawyers, bankers, and engineers are not within the cover of the Labour Act?
Well, add for that, 80% of the Labour Act refers to workers. And if that's what the person means, yes, then workers are persons who are exercising manual labor or clerical work. So if, for instance, you look at any provision of the Labour Act and you see the term workers, it does not contemplate bankers or lawyers or other professionals. Now, the reason why I said 80% is that there are also certain portions of the Labour Act where the term workers is not used to describe people. For instance, maternity provisions is used to describe women. So for a woman, whether she's a worker or not, then maternity provisions would apply. So a woman who is a banker, the same maternity provisions would apply to the same woman who's a banker and to the woman who performs clerical functions or manual labor in an organization. So yes, majority of the labor law provisions do not apply to persons who are professionals, but again, you have those few provisions that apply.
Thank you. The next question. Do you still think that it will amount to an unfair clause if the employee willingly agrees without any undue influence and the likes to proceed on leave till December without pay? So if the employee willingly agrees to go on leave until December without pay, is that still unfair?
Okay, so the thing about unfair clauses is that sometimes it doesn't really matter that the employee agreed. It's if the court has the discretion to determine that that's an unfair clause. Now, the way these things are viewed as that, the court looks at it like you were an organization, you were at an advantage. That employee was negotiating from his own, little corner, from his own disadvantaged position, and he wanted to keep his job, so he had no choice or to agree to those provisions. So even if he willingly agreed, I mean, employers also need to have that in mind, that if he goes to court or if that matter is challenged in court, the court may still, despite the employee's willingness, may still determine that, look, this is an unfair labor practice. You were at an advantage and you use that advantage to negotiate against him. So yes, it could still be determined as an unfair clause, despite the employee's willing consent.
Great, that was very clear. Another question for clarification. You mentioned that the law provides that a worker is entitled to leave of at least 6 days with pay. Clarification question, does it follow that where the leave is beyond 6 days, that the employer is well within his right not to pay?
No. What the Labor Act says is the 6 days is a minimum requirement. So even if you agree and he goes on leave for 30 days, let's assume that it's not a COVID issue. Even if he goes on leave for 30 days, you have to pay. It's leave with pay that is contemplated under the Labor Act.
Okay. And the first question that was raised today, how do you handle issues of employees demanding for risk allowance for working during this pandemic?
I don't know what risk allowance means. Is it, one of the things I would ask is it a contractually agreed provision? Now, if it was contractually agreed and the employee had been receiving it, then by contract is allowed to keep requesting for the risk allowance. Now, under Nigerian law, there's no such thing as risk allowance. So it would depend on the contract of the parties. So if it was a contractually agreed term, then yes, the employee will be within his rights to demand for his contractual entitlements. Now, if it was not contractually agreed, then I don't see how, and I don't know what the employee means by risk allowance, and I don't see how, the employee should be entitled to it.
Great, thank you very much. I think we went through all the questions that were raised in writing so far. Yolanda, please correct me if I have overlooked anything. Which means we would open the floor, as we still have time, to further questions, experience sharing. If you want to make a contribution or ask a question, you can use the function raise your hand, and then we will unmute you to share your contribution or question. So the floor is open for you to raise. I see one raised hand, Lei Akimbe. I'm unmuting you, I'm trying. I'm failing. I am failing. Yolanda, help me out. I'm not able to unmute. There we go.
Yeah, I think I'm on now. Hello?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. So my question is, for staff who have worked for less than a year and are not yet entitled to their leave, how do we handle it?
I mean, is that a question for me, I believe?
Yes, it is.
I guess.
Okay, yeah, sure. So in that circumstance, I would say, I mean, everyone is working from home. I don't know what your question really is. Is it, how do you handle that staff? Trying to get staff to go on leave now, or are people working remote? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because in that kind of work, we can't work remotely. They're caterers, so they have to work on site, and the site has been closed. So they've been working with us for only about a month and a half, and we've had to send them all home because the factory is closed. So now they're asking what happens to them. Are we going to be at home without any pay? Are we going to get any pay? I mean, so it's a bit of a challenge for us.
And I agree that it's a bit of a challenge, but it's something that you have to look at as a company and determine what you want to do. Do you want to negotiate with them, say some sort of maybe pay them something and say maybe pay them half pay? You really have to be able to negotiate and meet in the middle, because I mean, this is not a situation that anybody sees. There's really no answer direct to that, because I mean, your policy or the contract says they can only go on leave until a year into their contract.
Yes, but the thing is that for the month of April, we're going to be paying them a certain amount of money anyway of their salary. So my thing is,
Despite
we don't have to pay. I'm sorry?
I said despite them not working in April.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay.
So we've made that provision, but they are saying, well, they are technically on leave up until the end of, I don't know, because the leave started from end of March. So we're now saying,
except if you
Exactly.
declare that they're
They're
not on
not
leave.
they're not on leave. So it's almost like it's leave. Well, it's not leave, but they're not working. So for them, they're wondering what's happening. What if it happens beyond April?
Yeah.
What happens?
If I could chip in, I think that when organizations say you're on probation period, and after probation period, you will then get the benefits of going on leave. The probation period for active work. If you are not actively working, you're not even on probation, because there's nothing to even on what basis are we confirming your employment? We've not been able to test your capacity, test your competencies, test your work ethics, absolutely nothing. So I think it's worth having a conversation with them now, saying if we do resume, we're going to start counting from when you actually start active work. That is the only time we can say that we've had a successful probationary period, enough for you to be confirmed so that you can have your benefits. So if this issue, for example, should last till September, and then you open up shop again in October, they will start their probation from that period. I think it's even nice of you enough to say, you know what, I'm going to be giving you a stipend just to keep you with you till September, so that you don't leave, you know. But when you do start work, that's when your probation period actually kicks off again. But Dynamic can confirm, especially because of contract of employment. I too will need clarity on this. So if the contract of employment stated that your probationary period was to start on 1st of January and end 1st of September, and then because of this lockdown, can we now change the probationary period? Do we have to issue new contract of employment? On those areas, I'm not exactly sure.
Okay.
So, of course, that said, that even if there's no force majeure clause in your contract, then you can agree that there should be a suspension of that contract for a certain period of time, right? Because it's not your fault, it's nobody's fault. So if you agree to suspend, everyone suspends their obligations. It might seem like a difficult, hard decision to take, but the only option aside from that is termination, right? From an employer's, your sort of point now is either we suspend obligations up until September if we resume, or I terminate, and maybe you can apply again, or I can employ another set. But really, those are decisions that you have to take. But like Evie has just said, you've even been fair enough to offer a stipend. So I think it's just situations are peculiar to each company has its own peculiar facts. So those are the things that we have to do. So, but like I said, you can actually argue that it's a suspension of obligations on their part and on your part as well. You already pay for April and there's no work. So
absolutely. All right.
Can I just
thank you for that.
In suspending obligations, does it have to be documented? So a lot of business owners today, they make phone calls, they just have a conversation. Is this the sort of thing that you need to document, that this is what you said to the employee and they replied agreeing? Is this the kind of situation?
Absolutely, you have to. Because again, I know that I was caught up towards the end of my presentation, but I said that in the labor and employment space, we envisage that there's going to be a lot of disputes. And this sort of thing can cause a dispute. Look, we didn't know that we were suspended. But he says, oh, but I told you. So absolutely, it has to be documented. You also have to get their consent to say, look, everybody's agreeing that this obligation is suspended until blah, blah, blah. And the other option is termination. So absolutely, you need to document.
All right, thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question and the answers. We still have time, so we invite more people to raise their hands if they have a question or contribution to make. And also a reminder, you can keep your hands raised even if you're not yet called upon, so that we can build a waiting line. So anybody with a question, a comment, or experience they would like to share? There doesn't seem to be any discussion. All right, there is a question that has just been raised in the questions panel. a little clarification. Oh no, it's a comment. A little clarification on the previous question. Risk allowance here is contained in our engineers' terms and conditions, and it is usually given when they travel to places like Borno. Okay, so clarification on the risk allowance. So it is part of engineers' term. Yes, the question would, or the answer would then be, is it a contractual obligation? To what extent does it apply to the COVID-19 situation, which probably depends on the wording of the contract?
Exactly. Yes, yes, absolutely. Good.
Great. Thank you. Are there more questions, contributions, maybe experiences you've had yourself or you've seen with business partners, or questions raised by your teams, your employees, anything that needs clarification or can highlight some real life scenarios for the participants in this call? You can either raise your hand or type in the chat function or in the questions. That's up to you. Okay, Joy. Your turn.
Yeah, good afternoon. It's quite interesting, insightful, and effective. I just want us to take home the COVID-19 situation was never planned. So all these things we're saying has not been in place. It's not in the staff group. So it has to be like, if an organization must start taking decision, it's like going to form like a judicial president. In case of next time, I think the HR people should go back to the drawing board and put this kind of thing on the manual. The workers, they have to work at home. I'm not used to working at home, but it has come to stay. Since it has come to stay, we must now put it in our manual so that when there's someone like a first man, what do you do? This is what and what the staff are entitled to. Like I pump fuel, 21st, I pump fuel. If I even see working more than, because it's not strenuous working at home now. But there are so many tools that you don't have at home, is in the office, but you just have to work at home. And you need to be compensated. And the irony of it is that no money is coming in. So how can the organization survive? How can you now survive? But the organization must work. So we need to now place the balance of put something on our HR handbook in case of this is what the staff is entitled to, and this is what the non-staff, the ones that are maybe they don't their job has to do with in the office. This is what they are also entitled to, because it will not be fair for somebody that sits at home and you working from home, and at the end of the day you expect the same salary. That's my take. That's what I just want to know.
Okay, for those who couldn't hear Joy too well, just a summary of main points and questions. So Joy was referring to the fact that many organizations have been surprised by the COVID-19 situation, and they may not have had sufficient policies, for example, in place to deal with the situation. So one question hidden there is, how do companies handle gaps in their policy and contracts when they now have to take decisions? And more specifically, the fact that people now have to work from home when they may not have the equipment to work from home. How do you deal with that also in terms of HR measures? So it's both a call to, yes, we need to be better prepared, but what do organizations do now that were not prepared and are now totally surprised by the situation?
Okay, so I mean, nobody saw this coming, I mean, as 7 months ago, no one saw it coming, so I think both employers and employees have to understand that these are unprecedented times for everyone involved. And while I agree that the employer should also provide tools or look for ways to make the work from home easier for employees, I think the employees also need to understand that the employer too may not be generating income at this time. I mean, it's I think we just have to find a way to balance it. You know, I don't know if EVA is still on, but if she's, you know, maybe from a HR perspective, she can say, you know, what is necessary, what is needed. But, you know, we have to just find a way to balance it. That's what I think.
Evia, did you want to contribute?
Sorry, my system froze for a second. Okay, can you please take the question again, or the comment that was made?
Yeah, so the question evolved around the fact that many organizations have been surprised by the COVID-19 situation. So especially looking at policies or contract clauses that would be necessary but have not been put in place in advance. So how should these organizations deal with the situation? And specifically, the example was if people are now expected to work from home, but they don't even have the necessary equipment, what are recommendations how to handle that situation?
Well, I think that, like I said, conversations are extremely important, having conversations with your people. We were lucky enough to have planned earlier, because when we started looking at the news, paying attention to what was happening globally, we knew that it was going to get to Nigeria soon. So we were able to put in policies that were not there before. We quickly created them. But if you're currently at home and you were not able to do this ahead of time, what I do recommend is having conversations with your people, finding out what they need, what tools do you require. So a simple survey would work. Just do a survey with your employees, asking them, what are the challenges you have at home? What are the tools that you require? What do you need from us? And when you get that feedback, you can then look for ways you can procure items and send to them. The good part is that quite a number of delivery companies are working, you know, so I think that we can explore that as well. But make sure you do the survey, because when we did the survey, we realized that a number of our people already had laptops. So imagine if we didn't ask and we just went to procure laptops for people. We also realized that a lot of them already had internet, you know, so they didn't need to buy. All they needed was an extra allowance for data. So I think you should do a survey, find out from your people the work tools that they actually require, and then if you can afford it, please procure for them. And I think that this is also important for your human resources professional to also create a work from home policy. So we have to create that, because we know we're dealing with human beings. People just want to Netflix and chill. That's the truth, you know. So we have to create policies that were quite strict, such that people in the organizations understood that they were expected to clock in, were expected to know they were online. We also realized that performance management in this season may be different. So what we're going to really focus on is results. You know, it has to be results driven, because we cannot exactly check out the other competencies working from home. But for the lawyers, for instance, you have a task. Were you able to meet your task obligations? What was the result of that transaction? That's how we're going to be able to track performance management. And I think that most organizations need to consider that for this period.
Great, thank you. This ties in very nicely with one of the questions now raised in the questions pane. There is a question: is there a way an employee's working hours can be tracked while working remotely? Any recommendations how to track working hours?
Yes and no. It depends on it really depends on the nature of the work the employee does. It depends on the work tools. So I work in a legal firm. The good part is that we usually do timesheets, we do clocking hours. So that fully is easy for me to know, because I can track how many hours you've clocked in, working from the back end and the like. So I think it depends on the tools that you use as well. I also think that, so for example, if you use Microsoft Teams would allow you to be able to know when your employees were online, how long they were online for, and the like. So I think that we can explore, but I want us to be very careful in over policing our people, because we need to understand that this is such a difficult time. People are not just mentally and psychologically and emotionally okay. Some people work at odd hours. So for example, my entire sleep pattern has changed. I'm awake all night and I'm frustrated throughout the day. So imagine if my employer was trying to check if I'm working during the day. I'll probably not be, but at night I'm making up for the lost hours. So I think that we also need to trust our people and just move to giving tasks and results. I think that will just make things easier for you, because if you're trying to track how many hours the person is working, it may not work. Especially because now we have mothers who their children are literally mommy, 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 mommy. There's no way they can be attending to you at that time. It's difficult for a lot of people. So I think we should just go straight to giving tasks, responsibilities, and tracking results and deliverables. I think it will be way easier that way.
Thank you very much. There are more questions written, so I would continue with those questions submitted. The next question is, once an employee and employer have finalized the renegotiation of a contract term, does the employer need to reissue a revised contract of employment, or could it be in the form of an addendum, bearing in mind that the agreed term may only be drafted to subsist for the period of the pandemic?
It could be in the form of an addendum. It doesn't have to be a totally new, different contract. So it could be, sometimes it could also depend on the main contract. So some contracts will say, if we're going to amend any term, we have to do it by addendum. So check what your main contract says. But in the absence of anything like that, yes, you could just by an addendum, alter some terms of your contract, but it must be in writing. It must be documented.
Great, thank you very much. The next question, sorry for the background noise. Next question, will my company still be obliged to pay performance benefits of 2018, which has been provided for but yet unpaid before the pandemic? 2018 performance benefits.
That's a very interesting question. Now, I see this because...
Correct. 2019, there was a correction after. So performance benefits for 2019 that would have had to be paid out this year, is there an obligation to still do so, or an option to not to because of the pandemic?
Okay, so I have, let me explain the way that I think it would work. Now, if you were to rely on the pandemic only got to Nigeria. If it's a Nigerian company, I don't know if it's a multinational, so that would also depend. So, but if you were going to say, look, that portion of your contract has been frustrated, then you have to examine the dates at which that pandemic broke out in your country, or the date in which your frustration occurred. Now, if, for instance, the whole lockdown, the whole thing started today, then your obligations as at yesterday remain your obligations. They're still your contractual obligations. Right? But if there were obligations that were to accrue, say tomorrow, noting that the pandemic started today, or the first major or whatever affected you today, then you could waive those obligations. But because these are obligations for 2019, when everything was all good and rosy, yes, those obligations will still inure. Now, what an employer can do is to negotiate with the employees, because contractually the employer is bound to pay those benefits. But if the employer is able to negotiate with the employees to say, look, we know that we're supposed to pay, but this has happened and that has happened, we're not able to pay. Can we stagger the payments? Can we waive it, for now? Those kind of conversations need to be had, noting that in this case, the employer is contractually obliged to pay, because it's not an obligation that arose in March. So those are the kind of conversations that need to be had.
Okay. I'm just to chip in as well. I also think that it depends on the organization and what their plans are financially. Some organizations are saying, you know what, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, we need to save more, we need to keep our resources and the like. Some organizations are saying, you know what, they already did the work in 2019, surely they should be rewarded. So like I said, conversations are very important. You can tell your people, as opposed to 100 million usually we share for bonus, we're thinking that we want to share 50 million this year simply because of the pandemic. When things sort themselves out, then in 2020, when you're considering bonus, you can then give them something extra just to make up for it. But I think ultimately it depends on the organization and what they want to do financially.
Agreed.
Great. There are more questions, which shows that your contributions and your responses are really valued. Thank you very much for that. The next question is, with COVID-19 situation, is it okay for employers to pay their staff half salary for the month of April?
Again, it's about the conversations that you have. It's the negotiation that you can have with your employees. Now, you are mandated to pay salaries. I said that before in my presentation. But if because of the COVID situation, your employees are not working and you still want to pay half, yeah, sure, you can maybe reach a negotiation with them, but you need to negotiate. You need to be on the same page with your employees. Now, what the law would not want you to do is to take decisions like that without consulting with your employees. So yes, you can pay half salaries. There's nothing that stops you from doing that. Note that earlier in my presentation, I said if you're a worker, which is like the lower paid employees, clerical workers, manual laborers, you can't just take that decision. You need to consult with the an authorized labor officer, which is from the Federal Ministry of Labor and Productivity. So basically, you can't take that decision of those guys without involving the government. But if it's for employees above that cadre, then you don't need any government involvement. You can certainly, pay them half. But as long as you're on the same page with them, reach a negotiation with them, agree with them, and then I'm sure you could do it.
Thank you. The next question is linked to a discussion we had before. Relating to call cards, data, electricity units. However, in this case, we're looking at a company that added 50% on all employees' salaries in March, meaning on top, and is going to pay April salaries in full. Under these conditions, would it still be fair to request for funds to buy call cards, data, and electricity units to work remotely?
Evie, I think that question is for you. Ultimately, like I said, I think it just boils down to the organization. So for example, we gave an allowance for data, an extra allowance for data, because we wanted our people to be able to work from home. However, I know that there's an extent to which we can do that, because I think about it. So the person's remuneration, for instance, was 200,000 monthly. And of that 200,000, the person was spending 75,000 on transportation to work. That 75,000 naira has been saved. So why can't that now be used to provide data and pay for power? So I think that at the end of the day, I'm not sure that employers are obligated to. I think that conversations need to be held so that your people understand. In just having conversations with some of my colleagues, in other organizations, I make them understand too that for the organization, it's a burden. They're not making as much money as they used to, so they cannot be expecting the organization to expend as much cash. But the monies that you are saving just from okay, so for how many women here have actually gone to the salon in how many weeks? The money we used to go to the salon, we can use it to buy fuel to work. I'm just saying that sometimes we need to help our employees to open their minds to really understand that they are saving and they can actually use monies that were used for other things to augment for work. But ultimately, it boils down to the financial status of the company. I know many organizations that are giving extra monies for data, for power, and the likes, but some organizations just can't afford it. And I think just clarifying that your salary is made up of basic housing and transport, your transportation is no longer being used and it can be used for data and power.
Great. Now I'm glad my video is not working. Otherwise, you would comment further on the salon visits. We're running out of time. We have 2 more questions. If okay for you, we would take those questions in. 3 more questions. The first one of the last batch is just for clarity, in line with the discussion on probation periods. For an employee working from home, but with a probation period having commenced in March, Should the probation period still be suspended?
It depends. So in my view, if the employee is working from home, yeah, the probation period does not have to be suspended. In my law firm, for instance, we're all working from home, so it's like work as usual, but of course, you know, it's disrupted here and there. But if the employee is not working, if the employment is such that the employee cannot work from home or work remotely, then yeah, that probation period should be suspended, because how then do you gauge if the person, you know, is able to continue to work? Such a probationary period should be suspended in that circumstance.
Great. And final question, because the other question was about the presentation that, yes, we're going to share. The final question today: what measure is HR putting in place for workers so as to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace? Any advice or experience there?
Well, there is a lockdown now, so I'm sure that there's not much being done. But for people who are working in industries where you're still expected to go to work, I think it's just practicing social distancing and ensuring that your HSE policy is as intact as possible. So let's just do everything that has been recommended by WHO and NCDC. Ensure that you provide everything that your people need to wash their hands, to sanitize, the facial mask, ensure that desks, spaces in the office are now rearranged such that people are not really sitting very close to each other and the likes. I think that we can just do the basic we can and then continue to sensitize our people, you know, about being extremely cautious and careful during this period.
Fantastic. So this was the end of the questions that have been raised. We have all taken them up. As we said, we're going to share the presentation. I think this has been an excellent session. We can tell by the questions and by the activities from the participants that this was a really timely intervention and information, very well received. We actually received a few comments in the question section of people saying this was a really good session. So I want to thank in particular Perinami Momodu and Ivi Temitayo Ibitoye for your contributions, for your input, for your answers to our questions. We're very happy that you took the time and your expertise into this call. I also want to thank all the participants and can just encourage everybody to stay in touch with us, with the delegation of German Industry and Commerce in Nigeria. We're trying to put webinars and information at your disposal to help you navigate this time of uncertainty. And as I said in the beginning, also to prepare for the time after, because we will get out of it and we have to be ready for getting out of it, and we will get out of it stronger. So thank you very much to everybody, to our speakers in particular. We really appreciate your contributions, and please stay in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.